This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Long story short, just like you develop any profession, like you see doctors do residencies, you are shadowed and mentored by a chaplain. They look at what your attitudes, assumptions, values, and beliefs are when you have these interactions, and you basically you look at everything under a microscope. Not everyone's favorite thing, especially if they don't like counseling or if they don't like looking at themselves, but you really got to be aware of how these things impact the way you talk to other people.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. Chaplain Wes Moldogo is talking with me today about spiritual counseling and the needs of veterans at the end of life. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
The sponsor for today's episode is the Death Deck. The Death Deck is a card game and conversation tool that uses humor to create lively conversations about a topic that impacts us all, death. The Death Deck's goal is to normalize conversations on death and dying. The Death Deck also features the EOL deck, or End of Life deck. Designed for use with individuals who may be approaching end of life, the EOL deck digs deep into legacy building and end-of-life preferences. Visit thedeathdeck.com to order your decks today. This episode is sponsored by International Doula Life Movement. International Doula Life Movement proudly presents their free online birthday bash from January 8 to January 12, 2024. The Birthday Bash is IDLM's gift to the doula community. This is an opportunity to connect with like-minded professionals, exchange ideas, and build lasting relationships that will elevate your death doula practice. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity. Register now at internationaldoulalifemovement.com/classes. And remember, it's free.
So my guest today is a hospital chaplain and a PRN hospice chaplain, and he is a chaplain for the military. Wes Moldogo is my guest today, and he is a chaplain for the Oregon Army National Guard's 162 Infantry Regiment. He holds a Master of Divinity degree, and he completed his clinical chaplaincy residency at Stanford Healthcare. Wes has completed 2 overseas tours, one in Africa and one in the Middle East. He is an adamant supporter for integrating spiritual care into the care of our patients, service members, and their families. This was a great conversation. This guy's got a very bright, active mind, and he's very dedicated to quality and excellence in chaplaincy. So he's going to tell us the story about how he came to be a chaplain, how he even got to the work that he's doing now. And he talks about how a chaplain can add value to the plan of care, to the care that's being provided for a patient. He's also going to explain how chaplains can help patients find their voice and voice their values to the healthcare team, to identify what their priorities are and what their values are. And Wes has some great ideas about how the idea of chaplains can be successfully introduced to patients, because other clinicians and other disciplines on the team aren't always really good at talking about chaplains, who they are, and the work that they do. So Wes has some suggestions for that are going to be really helpful. So here's my conversation with Chaplain Wes Moldogo. Wes, welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast.
Hey, it's good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. It's going to be great because we're talking about veterans, we're talking about spiritual counseling, chaplaincy, a great topic that a lot of people misunderstand. But before we get started, I want to ask you sort of a question to get to know you a little bit, let my listeners get to know you a little bit. What is one piece of advice you would give your younger teenage self?
Oh, wow. Well, that's hard because if I said something really specific, I don't know if I turn out the same way I am now. And I like life. I like being a chaplain. You know what I would tell my younger self? Spend more time with mom and dad. I genuinely mean that.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's nice.
In fourth grade, my dad, he really tried to do the family thing. And so he bought these Leatherman jackets with all our names embroidered on it. And as a kid, I thought that was the dumbest thing in the world. Who does that with their mom and dad? You know, I'm an only child. And so I realize what that means now when I look at kids and their relationship, you know, with their parents at end of life. And I'm like, oh man, that was a missed opportunity. Shame on me for having an attitude. Yeah.
But doesn't our definition of family sort of change and how we value family? Doesn't that sort of change as we grow up and become adults and all of a sudden you hit 25, 27 and you realize my parents were geniuses. I should have listened to everything they said.
Oh gosh. Yeah. The realization, the epiphany when that finally happens,
Yeah.
it's real.
Yeah, that whole adulting is very hard. Whose stupid idea was this? And I want to move back home. I don't like this, having my own bills and all that. It's very overrated.
Oh, man. But I would definitely treat my parents different I would definitely treat my parents different growing up. I was kind of a rude kid growing up.
That's a nice piece of advice. I like that. All right, well, let's get started on where you are now. I love the fact that you love being a chaplain. So how did you get started in chaplaincy?
Yeah, so two stories. One positive experience and one very negative experience. So right out of high school, I was religiously on fire. And so in order to supplement that religious zeal, I went to a private Christian university. And there was no way I could pay for a private university. And so I tried getting any scholarship I could have. And the only one I got at that point was a Army ROTC scholarship. And so I go to this college with this Army ROTC scholarship. I get medically disqualified because we have to take a physical in order to qualify and keep the scholarship for eczema after the age of 9. It was really random. And it was just the point where they were cutting budgets, right, for that fiscal year. And I just happened to be, you know, the guy with the one spot on the record. So I got it cut. And so I'm in my dorm, the common areas, just mulling and grieving really about how am I going to pay for college. I can't believe I got cut, that thing. And the dorm mates, my roommates, they were empathetic, but with them also being religiously Christian, they tried to, I use the word solve, they tried to console and solve things by giving me a bunch of scripture or Bible verses, and I didn't feel heard, right? And so they would continue to console me for the next few weeks, but I still didn't feel heard, and there was this deep sense of, ugh, right? And finally, I ran into the campus chaplain, right? And he did nothing but just listen to me. And I noted immediately I felt better. And so that was my first impression of a chaplain. And he distinguished himself as a chaplain, not a pastor, but a chaplain. And that just planted the seed for what that discipline held in the future. And then I ended up joining the National Guard because I lost my Army ROTC scholarship in California. And my very first experience with a military chaplain was I had a friend whose mother was terminally dying in the hospital. She was intubated rather. And long story short, she died, and they called the chaplain over because he was just a high risk for what they believed to be suicide ideation. And the chaplain, very similar to what my friends did in the dorm, he tried to console in the only way he knew how as a religious leader, which was to cite a lot of religious literature and jargon. But really what this guy wanted, and he was not religious himself, he just wanted someone to listen and console him and comfort him. And so I witnessed the whole thing. At the end of that, I ended up being the comforter. And as a religious Christian myself, I felt somewhat embarrassed, but I didn't know what language to use at that point. I just knew something was wasn't working. That tool that guy used was not the tool to be used. And I ended up comforting him. I still keep in contact with that guy today. Right. So those are the two big reasons why I honed in on chaplaincy. And after I joined the National Guard, I ended up enrolling in seminary, looking and just maybe pursuing the possibility of doing some organized type of ministry and profession. And everything just sort of came together, being in the National Guard, being in seminary, just seeing the need for it, holistically. And that's when this whole thing popped off. So that's how I became a chaplain initially. First in the military, I realized I didn't have the experience most of my peers had. They were a little older. I'm younger, so I became a chaplain around 24, 25, 26, military-wise. I did not have this church experience. And so the way I thought I could offset that or balance that out is, well, let me pursue clinical chaplaincy because there doesn't seem to be much there. And that's when I was introduced to the whole, clinical chaplaincy model, how it is in the hospice settings versus just the congregation. And there's a very distinct difference, right?
Right.
And yeah, that clinical muscle then impacted the military muscle. And that's what really got the ball rolling. And I think the two complement each other very much. So that was quite a bit. Thanks for asking that question. I hope I parsed that out.
Absolutely. I think it's so important for people to hear how chaplains got their start in the work, because it is very different. We do have a lot of chaplains, at least here in my part of the country. We're sort of at the tail end of the Bible Belt. A lot of our folks have come from a work history of pastoral ministry, which is completely different and does not necessarily equip you to be a hospice chaplain. There is a great difference. And I think the general opinion or general understanding is those are one and the same. It's not the same thing. And a chaplain can be an atheist, can be a Buddhist, can be a Christian, can be a priest, can be a monk. And we do have chaplains that come from all those different faith systems and belief systems. But knowing where the roles stop and start and where our personal beliefs stop and start and how they influence the work of a chaplain and anybody who works in hospice, anybody who works in end-of-life care, I think that's really important information for people to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, Helen. And I don't know if this heads into some of the misconceptions of chaplains, but for whatever reason, as forward as someone may be, the general insinuation I tend to see people react to when someone asks the screening question, which I don't even think is a great screening question, by the way. Do you want to speak to a chaplain? I mean, what comes to your mind? Often, someone that's religiously zealous and is there to talk about nothing but that.
Right.
Right. And especially at HPCO, I know they really lean on that Pekalski definition of chaplaincy, things that involve meaning and purpose, things that people hold sacred. That's really what I think board certified chaplains and chaplains with the clinical experience really unlock and can really contribute to that care plan. And I don't know if we want to pause here, but I will say everyone has the ability to do that. And especially when I talk to these really savvy doctors, nurses, they've been around the block. They can ask the right questions, but I just don't know if they have enough time. And so having someone really specialize in that and like really honed in, and they water the grass with these patients for like a lot of these long length of stays, and maybe on hospice too, you're on for like a year, like that's a big difference. And that could be a big X factor.
Well, I mean, the chaplains, their time is devoted to those conversations. That's what they are there for. That's the focus of their care. So let me ask you this. You said you are a deeply religious Christian, right? Do you ever find that your personal belief systems get in the way of the interventions that you offer as a chaplain?
We could what if this a lot, but I think if I had not received the training initially from the chaplain residencies, I'd like to inform the listeners that we chaplains, we tend to do residencies before becoming chaplains or doing something called CPE or Clinical Pastoral Education. Long story short, just like you develop any profession, like you see doctors doing residencies, you are shadowed and mentored by a chaplain. They look at what your attitudes, assumptions, values, and beliefs are when you have these interactions. And you basically you look at everything under a microscope not everyone's favorite thing, especially if they don't like counseling or if they don't like looking at themselves. But you really got to be aware of how these things impact the way you talk to other people, right? So, as a veteran, if I were to talk to someone that wasn't a veteran that hated the military, I would need to know that I would have an illicit reaction. And does that make that person any less of a human or any less worthy of good care, whether it be medical or non-medical, right? So that type of training helps that. But going back to your question, if I didn't have that training, I think I was step in the same snare a lot of people do, being reactive, being emotionally unintelligent. And that's why I think this is why I want folks to invest in good, well, I should say good chaplains, but rather chaplains that have that background and that training. It's a lot to go through, underpaid.
Absolutely.
And board certification is its own deal. It's kind of a pain in the butt to go through. So please, please consider that for the folks listening that are hiring chaplains.
Yeah, board certification is a big process. It is because of the CPE, the hours that have to be devoted to it. And we do have, I think, a large part of our workforce that doesn't have access or the ability, the time to be able to become board certified. So we know we have chaplains that need training when they come to us. A lot of times it's people like me. It's the nurse. The nurse may be a director of nursing, a director of all the team, and the administrator at the same time. So we're not just supervising nursing clinicians, we're also supervising social workers and chaplains. And I think a lot of times the nurses don't know exactly what the chaplains should be doing either.
Yeah, I do realize consistently throughout my short clinical life, and even in the military, the chaplain, you just do your own thing. I mean, that's kind of the attitude. Oh, he's just doing the chaplain thing. And that's good and bad. That's bad if you have a chaplain that may not, that could use some feet under the fire, and if they have no sense of direction in terms of how to integrate themselves and self-start, that becomes very troublesome. And you know what? Kudos to the folks that, well, I should phrase it like this. That may not also be a bad thing in the sense of, if they know what to do and if they're savvy and experienced enough, that space is a good space. But I would want some type of screening if I manage chaplains. I would hope whoever's managing them, please have them back brief you, or rather have them explain to you what their day's like and if it's productive.
Yeah. Talk about the interventions that they're providing and get an understanding of what a typical day looks like. What exactly is it that you do on a daily basis? So I do want to talk about that. So you are a hospice chaplain part-time, but you're also a hospital chaplain. What would you say are the differences between those two positions, between hospital chaplaincy and hospice chaplaincy?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I've always wondered if people thought they were the same. Personally, my impression is that, yeah, some people do, but it really is just, so if I looked at, a patient's journey on the continuum, right? So you have like before you enter the hospital, I like using the phrase upstream, before you head into this crazy, medical interventions, aggressive, right? And then maybe you get out of the hospital, go to, post-acute care, SNF, home health. And then at the very end of it, that would be hospice. Goals change. And that's how I would define the difference between chaplaincy in those settings. So hospice, unless something's changed in the past, year, I've never seen a goal hospice not be comfort. I've even explained to some patients in the hospital, it's about aggressive comfort. And so spiritual care in the hospice setting is primarily comfort. In the hospital setting, what I do notice is that there might be some comforting, because I think that's part of the general counseling pastoral role. There's an image of that, but there's a lot of situations where maybe it's decision making regarding what kind of medical intervention or what medical course of action someone should take based on their values. Because and this might be another deep well discussion, maybe for a different podcast. I hear it frequently discussed on Jerry Powell, sometimes things aren't presented in a way that is rooted in a patient's or family's values in the hospital. And that's where spiritual care begins to become really beneficial. Also, I would say on the continuum, especially when you trend more end of life, and shout outs to the Peaceful Present Project. They're like the main doula crowd out there in Central Oregon. They have training where they've explicitly cited research where they found that 90% of end-of-life care is non-medical. And so when you look at that continuum, especially when you head into that post-acute care stage, the non-medical stuff, sure, it's psychosocial, but arguably, especially when you think about meaning, purpose, the things that influence a person's, meaning making, or I should say their decision making, that's where the spiritual care, and that's where the chaplain should really begin to insert themselves, maybe not insert themselves, but socialize themselves into, have you considered this? Well, what about this? Don't you want to live to see your grandson's graduation? I'm using the most cliche examples, by the way, but that's the difference between hospice chaplains and then, maybe spiritual care in the inpatient settings. I'd also sprinkle a little bit of hope. A lot of folks can use some encouragement. I think about how our long length of stay patients, where they just need to get motivated enough by physical therapy to get on out of there. But, a lot of things are rolling against them. And so am I saying one is easier than the other? I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that I really think folks should be privy to the type of care chaplains, different spiritual care looks like on the continuum. And I do use the continuum very explicitly. So thanks for asking that. I really wonder how much folks realize that.
Yeah, I can see when patients are having and families are having to make decisions, the information is given to them by the medical clinicians, and then chaplains and social workers sort of help them suss out what their priorities are. What are your values? Here's what I hear you telling me. Here's what I know about you. Here's what I've learned. And I think that's a really big advantage to a decision maker who is not the patient. If you've got a medical power of attorney or a healthcare proxy who's trying to figure out, well, would Dad want this? Is this a good decision? Does this align with who he is and what he wanted? Sometimes having a chaplain there to talk about values, talk about beliefs, talk about priorities, that's really helpful.
Oh, yeah. And I remember on one of your podcasts talked about, had the death doula on, and they were talking about being almost like a proxy, historian for that person because they know him so well. My hope, especially when you look at hospitals that have rotating attendings like crazy, and you have residents rotating like crazy, and even nurses that do the 3-3, but you have that one chaplain, right, that gets to know that patient and waters the grass very methodically, slowly, non-invasively. I would expect them to have some pulse on what their values are. And maybe that's just my projection of what I think a chaplain should be, but I mean that. So other disciplines listening out there, please value your chaplain in the hospital and hospice, obviously.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you. I think it's very difficult. I mean, think about a lot of our older folks that go into the hospital. They're being taken care of by a hospitalist who does not know them.
I'm going to think about, I'm trying to choose my words because I wonder what hospitalists are listening to this.
And I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm just saying if you're admitted at 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning, your attending physician is not going to be the one to see you for the weekend. The person treating the patient more than likely is someone that doesn't know them.
Yes, right. And there's only so much stuff a busy clinician can chart within their scope of practice, so to speak.
Right.
And I know different healthcare systems speak differently, but I don't know how much non-medical stuff are on their medical thing and what's parsed out. But no, I believe that's definitely a thing. But in all fairness, I do see some hospitalists, and this is how I know their practice is advanced. They are able to suss out some really good information. I don't think they're going to chart it, but they know what that patient wants just through a good conversation. And that just speaks to, I think how they're teaching holistic spirituality on a generalist level, in medical schools and residencies. I give a lot of credit to them.
Yeah, those are important conversations. And I'm with you. I don't think we always have space and time for those. You have to make them.
The Heart of Hospice is proud to feature this episode's sponsor, The Death Deck, the game and conversation tool that's changing the way we talk about life's most profound subject, death. Featuring 112 cards with multiple choice and open-ended questions, the Death Deck sparks lively discussions whether you're with your partner, your family, or a group of friends. The Death Deck can also be used at conferences or work gatherings as a creative icebreaker. It's easy to hand-select the questions that fit best with your audience. People are also gathering in breweries and their communities to host Death Over Drafts events, using the Death Deck to engage participants in conversations about death and dying. The Death Deck now features a new product, the EOL Deck, or End of Life Deck. The EOL Deck has softer language designed for individuals who may be approaching end of life. Both decks educate the participants on topics related to hospice and palliative care services, death doulas, green disposition, and end-of-life options. For a 20% discount, use the code HOSPICE20 at checkout. Visit thedeathdeck.com to order your decks today. It's time to start the conversation. This episode is sponsored by International Doula Life Movement. International Doula Life Movement proudly presents their online Birthday Bash from January the 8th to January 12th, 2024. And the best part? It's absolutely free. Join International Doula Life Movement for 5 days of inspiration, education, and celebration. This virtual event brings together nurses, doulas, and authors specializing in end-of-life care for an unforgettable experience. You'll be diving into intensive training sessions led by experienced nurses, renowned death doulas, and best-selling authors. Learn the latest in death doula practices, discover new techniques, and expand your skill set. The Birthday Bash is IDLM's gift to the doula community. This is an opportunity to connect with like-minded professionals, exchange ideas, and build lasting relationships that will elevate your death doula practice. This is your chance to learn from the best in the business. Explore the many facets of death doula work, whether you're a seasoned professional or just starting your journey. Uncover the various roles death doulas play and discover the unique contributions each type brings to the end-of-life experience. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to celebrate International Death Doula Life Movement's online Birthday Bash, January the 8th to January 12th, 2024. And remember, it's free. Register now at internationaldoulalifemovement.com/classes.
We've talked about the roles of the chaplains, and of course, it's very misunderstood by so many people that don't work inside the healthcare system, and I think in other silos of healthcare besides end-of-life care in hospitals. What do you think is the biggest myth about chaplaincy and chaplains that you've ever encountered?
Okay, it's kind of a threefold answer. So the first one is you're just religious, right? And so I know there have been studies out there about how not religious, so to speak, or even maybe I could parse out religious, like not organized religious, in terms of religious organization someone is, and therefore, well, why would I need a chaplain, right? So there's that. And then prior to this, I talked about this broad, but also very inclusive definition of spirituality that is widely accepted, and through research and study showed has an impact, in the general, medical course of action or medical plan in someone's admission or hospice. When I talk about comfort at end of life, I mean, that, like I said earlier, 90% of end of life is non-medical besides symptom management. And I guess it depends on how crazy that symptom management is. But
right.
So there's that they're just these religious folks, just for religious people. Two is, how much a chaplain can engage, and have a weighted voice in some of these conversations. For example, during my residency, I witnessed a really, really good chaplain kind of get shut down by, I want to say it was a PA during rounds, but that chaplain had some critical information. It was, that person's culture influencing, that fork in the road decision. And it wasn't like it was a bad thing, but prior to, us going there, I believe that physician's assistants training really uplifted disciplines over other disciplines. And so, and I say this not to say that chaplains should be the top of the food chain, but I do wonder, and I see it better now, can we not listen to the chaplain's input a little more frequently, just like social workers might feel off-put sometimes. CNAs, right? I think they're with the same folks every day, especially with the shortage. And I mean, just these unheard disciplines. I think they have a say for the big picture. So anyway, that's another misconception or myth, that chaplains should not have a say within the setting. And maybe they do, but sometimes even the people giving them space may not have a full understanding about what they can offer. And so, oh my gosh, why are you talking about, your observation of them being bedbound more frequently? Well, it contributes to the whole plan because I know them, right? I think this might be a hit on their morale, stuff like that, right, Helen? And then finally, I think the misconception, and I'm trying to find the best language for it because it's like a misconception, but it's the way it's being presented. And so it's the way it's being screened. So for example, I remember talking to you before we started recording, and I was basically saying, when we have nurses screen, both on hospice and in the hospital, do you want to see a chaplain? I don't think that's the best way to socialize that, right? I could tell you, as a really religious person, and I might take that back in a bit. I don't know if that's the best wording for it. As a deeply convicted religious Christian, if someone asked me in the hospital, do I want to see a chaplain? I'd probably say no myself, because I have that image of a chaplain sometimes, that they're this deep. And so I really wish that other disciplines would allow chaplains to kind of do their own screening, allow them to introduce themselves, because I'll flat out tell you, I've literally seen folks, for whatever reason, not be religious, not even have language for a deeply held conviction, but because the connection from the chaplain that introduced themselves is so strong and it's so pleasant, yeah, I've seen folks say, yeah, I wouldn't mind having a follow-up visit with this person. And that doesn't mean that they're going to go seek religion, but it just means, hey, this person is another set of eyes and ears to talk about my values and sacred beliefs, and that understands my medical course of action, because I expect them to be competent clinically as well. So I put that under the category of misconception, because yeah, these screens are harsh on us, man. These screens are super harsh on us.
So what I hear you saying is the patients don't know what chaplains do. The other team members don't know what the chaplains do. You don't have to be super into organized religion to benefit from the interventions of a chaplain, and the chaplains bring incredible value to the interventions and the conversations that a whole care team is providing.
Yes. For folks that would look down upon chaplains from maybe a Judeo-Christian background that did not, uplift a certain message, I would beg for them to reconsider that. It doesn't mean you're compromising a certain belief.
So Wes, I want to touch back on that.
Yeah,
that's super important. So what you're saying is a chaplain can have a Christian background, a Buddhist background, whatever kind of background, and provide care for someone who does not share that particular faith or belief system, and never compromise anything that they themselves as the chaplain believe.
Yes. And I do supplement that with, they themselves must come to a place of closure where that is not in friction. And then two, I would really, really underline and really emphasize that. And I say this as a veteran, we're in a country where we have the freedom for religious belief, and there's no real reason to trample someone else's, because it's that same, freedom of religion that allows you to believe and hold deeply held convictions that you do, basically. And so I'm flat out going to say that. So thanks for helping me parse that out. I know this is a hot topic, even for, I'll talk to every so often I'll run into a pastor for a religious organization or congregation that says, hey, I think the work you do is cool. I want to do that too. But when I listen to them, I'm less confident in their ability to adjust to it, just because what's deeply held down is a sense of we use the word proselytizing, but I mean, really, it's to make priority your religious faith versus the patient or families, right? Or whatever they hold deeply. And that's where the line is. And I don't know if people know where to draw the line. And as we talk about veterans later on, we talk about what moral injury is. I've literally seen, religious communities and religious leaders have a sense of moral injury by not disclosing their religious belief. because they feel like they're doing their neighbor harm. But that might be another well for a different podcast for a different day, right?
I mean, that's a big topic in hospice. So the role of the chaplain by philosophy and nature is it's all about the patient. It's all about the patient and the family. So you may come in with a certain belief about narcotics as a nursing clinician, or how they should manage their family dynamics as a psychosocial clinician, our social workers, or spiritual beliefs as a spiritual clinician, which is what I believe hospice chaplains are. And we come in with our own set of whatevers, and yet none of that actually matters. So this is my end all be all thought about hospice chaplains. I think that anyone who comes, and this is not just chaplains, I guess it could apply to anyone on the interdisciplinary team. If you come to the care of a patient or a family member with the idea that you will proselytize, convert, change, or save, quote unquote, to alter their religious beliefs, that is exploitation. And you are hitting them at one of the most vulnerable times in a person's life when they are seriously ill and or dying. That is exploitation of that situation and that person.
Yeah, I plus one that any chaplain out there with a soft agenda, and when I say soft agenda, I mean a soft agenda of changing someone's opinion to yours. I would strongly question the professional.
Yeah, but I think that's true. I think that chaplains do go in if they haven't received any training. And of course, in rural areas, we struggle with staffing. So we're taking the people that come to us that are ordained or certified because they're qualified under the regulations, but they have no training. And so they have misconceptions themselves. And if that doesn't get corrected, their goal is, well, I plan to help each of these people find where they should be going when they die while I'm taking care of them. That is not our job.
Definitely. And this might be a good segue into like military stuff, but like as a military chaplain as well, I would say one of the things taught at we call it the chaplain schoolhouse. We all get our training there. It's kind of like the base, right?
Mm-hmm.
For all get all their chaplain specific training for the military. And the Army, it's at Fort Jackson. And what's emphasizes that not only are we providers and curators for other folks' deeply held convictions and religious beliefs, but we're also an ethical gatekeeper for times where religion should not be brought into this and protecting. So let's say you had a soldier, or maybe in the clinical setting, a patient or family that's like, I'm not religious, but maybe you have someone else that's really imposing that on them. It is the chaplain's role. I strongly believe it's within that skill set to say, hey, no, let them be who they are, and this is their care.
And that does happen. We see families who have certain belief systems and the patient has something different, and they're at odds with each other. I've seen that numerous times. So let's talk about military chaplaincy. You are also a military chaplain. What does a chaplain do to support armed forces, to support military personnel?
Yeah, so unless there's some like crazy thing out there that I haven't learned of yet, my understanding is that the first chaplains were military chaplains. So in the Revolutionary War, they predate those times, right? And so they were these institutional figures that at that time, it sounded like religion was not just a deeply held conviction, but also a very cultural thing. And they helped parse out a few things with, especially when you thought of theology back then and how people learned it. These were some deep thinkers that knew how to apply things. I think of that savvy doctor in the hospital or at a hospice rather, it's just like, you can kind of see the ripple effects of someone saying something or making a course of action down the line. Same thing with these guys. They knew how someone's deeply held influence could impact maybe a commander's decision, or maybe a political party that was supportive of the commander, right? And so they have these strong roots in the military. And in the military, it's interesting because I would argue that one of the big differences that make the chaplain corps in the military so that they have absolute confidentiality. So under Title 10, United States Code Title 10, if you're on military orders as a chaplain, no one can bring up anything. I know behavioral health officers, I know leaders, they have a duty to warn, and they have a mandated reporting requirement. But as a chaplain, you could say some crazy stuff like you're going to go off a leader in your own section, and we cannot bring that up. And that's what, going back to what people hold sacred, meaning and purpose, that allows someone to really be themselves, assuming that the chaplain isn't a weirdo and people can open up to them, right? So you really see the chaplain in the military getting someone's real self. And especially in the military, folks managing perception as leaders, because it becomes very exterior. You look at someone's uniform all the time. You look at what awards, what tabs they have, and rank. It's very exterior. The chaplain often in the military is that I'm going to make space for you to be who you are. And this is why they've been championed as the confidant for all these centuries, right? So there's that. And then like trickling down, it kind of goes down to the type of spiritual care I would probably describe in the clinical setting. So emotional support, I use the word counseling support, and then an assessment of, meaning and purpose, things people hold sacred. But in the military, another word I've seen frequent use for that is morale. And morale being impactful because that's a unit's heart for what drives them to camp out, in like 20-degree weather, for patrolling exercises, right? Or running a patrol lane. So like these are the small things that the chaplain should have a pulse on, almost like watering the grass. Like I've also noticed chaplains on active duty because they live there. They do life every single day with the same service members and subsequently their families, if they're married or have kids. They get to know them on such a level where, man, that watering the grass, like at the end of the year, it's not just grass anymore. I mean, full-on forest is grown, right? So they have a lot of weight. And so if you're having a soldier that's just having some friction points with the command, that chaplain really can be the key factor in influencing that soldier. I'm not saying they should project that onto them, but gosh, could you really reconsider, because my boss is the commander, and please reconsider this for the good of the unit. I mean, that's a very specific scenario. It also leads me to another point. Chaplains are advisors to the command in the military. I guess very similar to what advising role we have in the clinical setting, but they really do give advice to the command on seemingly a confidential level as well. So that chaplain should always have the right ear of that commander and say, hey, you might want to do a class or a workshop or have a theme of financial readiness this month, because clearly we have a bunch of privates out there buying Camaros with 20%, 27% interest rates. I mean, like stuff like that, right? Like they have a hit on that. So similar but different. And then we want to bring in the whole thing on war. And I'm not saying that it doesn't feel like war in the clinical setting. I've heard people during the COVID time describe the clinical setting being like war, and that might be its own conversation, but when people grapple going to war, what they leave behind, and then during war, so to speak, and then maybe some deliberate action where it involves violence. It's funny, we train up for that, but especially when you talk to someone afterwards, it just hits different. I think that's the best way I could phrase that. It just hits different, especially when it settles in. And when I talk about meaning and purpose, sometimes someone can have a negative sense of meaning and purpose. And the chaplain should be able to suss that out. Over the centuries, we've had shoulders we stand on where, we can identify, note trends, hundreds of years ago. I'm glad it's more talked about now, but we really can bring that insightful wisdom, to that soldier. But I would also think that involves bringing in folks like really good behavioral health officers, which I think they get a bad reputation as well. They're good counselors, but similar but different contexts, right?
Yeah. So there's a great deal of our population inside hospice, the Medicare hospice patients, that are military veterans. One in four. That's 25% of the Medicare hospice patients, which is a big number because the majority of patients on hospice in the United States are Medicare patients. These are our older folks. So what would you say are some of the unique needs that these veterans have at end of life?
Yeah. So I've been going back and forth with like other folks who like champions this cause. I mean, veteran end of life is a very specific thing. I know they're very, so shouts to Quinn Gallagher. She is a death doula who has developed a framework herself for stuff like this. And I'd say the folks out, like, for example, the Central Oregon Veterans Ranch, they're trying to as well, develop some type of spiritual framework for folks, veterans rather, end of life. And so at first I start off with 5, but really three big themes come to my mind. And so I think of PTSD/trauma type of things. And I'm only going off the definition our lovely, state behavioral health officer for the state of Oregon defines PTSD: exposure to violence, exposure to danger, to harm, right? And how that impacts a person, whether they know it or not, in their future actions. And then how subsequently, when you bring up hospice, how that may come up. And so, yeah. I mean, and hospice is so mysterious. Sometimes we try to find the etiology for something, and especially when it becomes spiritual, and it's you can't prove it with medical stuff. It's like, well, this is just our interpretation of things. For example, the World War II man with 7A, 7B dementia that's just screaming out, but the one thing this guy screams out is his buddy's name he deployed with, in World War II. I mean, and so we can make a couple of educated assumptions, but we don't know for sure, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes combat trauma, military sexual trauma, especially for older campaign veterans. And I say this as far back as World War II, and like the embarrassment from that, and then what that brings to someone when they're at end of life. And sometimes in today's military, we have a very open door policy. Actually, we have something called the no wrong door policy, where you report that and it's never really the wrong door. That gets reported, right? Especially with recent events with things at Fort Hood. But how frequently I see that end of life has surprised me, both inpatient and in a hospice. And, coming to closure with that, I've seen one person triggered during a We Honor Veterans ceremony because that certificate presentation, it reminded them of that particular moment, or for whatever reason did, right? So those are things in terms of non-medical stuff. When I think of spirituality, 90% of it being non-medical, end of life, that's where that comes into play. So some type of trauma. I do bring up what Deborah Grassam calls soul injury, and not feeling like yourself, like a part of you is just not yourself after something, some experience or some event in the military. I relate that as well. I've noted a lot of that is related to a lot of moral injury. And so while something may not clinically be traumatic to a person, which I also think is very subjective, Helen.
Sure.
I think, wow, I spent a whole year supporting this commander whose philosophy negatively impacted and caused internal stress, maybe some administrative mistakes, and maybe some combat-related mistakes that resulted in death. That's gotten to several people in the past. I know in recent documentaries where they link, our government to, maybe inadvertently supplying enemies of our country with certain weapons, that's gotten some veterans in the past. And then, what does it mean for them to come to grips and closure with that? That's a very big thing. So that sense of moral injury, big deal. I know our hospice clinicians see a lot of that as well, to a degree. And so I think you talk about folks that could relate to veterans the most. I think clinicians can, personally, right? But just how much time do you have to parse that out with your crazy hospice census as a RNCM or social worker, right? And then finally, anything that involves closure for anything negative. And, this ranges from I got investigated, or maybe I didn't deploy into a combat zone. For whatever reason, it bothers you when we bring this up. Or when we talk about your service. So don't bring it up. And sometimes that's a hip fracture surgery that doesn't need to happen, so to speak. Sometimes it does, in terms of spiritual care. And those are the 3 big trends I notice at end of life for veterans. I've always believed in the it takes a village approach, by the way, Helen. I think every clinician on that team has the right to bring it up. I just wonder to what quality and how comfortable they feel bringing it up. That's always been the case in point. So I'll use the example. And a lot of these veterans, I notice they just want to feel heard about it if it is meaningful to them, or if it's a thing bothering them. They just want to feel heard and not solved. Kind of like my first example. That's why I brought up that example as well, coincidentally, of no one realized I lost an ROTC scholarship, and all that chaplain did at that university campus was just listen.
Just listen to you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the situation you were describing about veterans who are at end of life telling the hospice personnel, when they're asked, are you a U.S. military veteran? They said, yeah, but all I did was this and this. So basically, they're devaluing their service and the sacrifices they made and the sacrifices of their family unless they served in active combat. I had people tell me that I was in an administrative role, or I worked stateside the whole time, or, I did different things, and a lot of it had to do with morale and things like that. So they devalue, and basically they think that they don't deserve any recognition, even though the service was given. And, there's a little bit of a pecking order. It's the most valuable service is when you served active duty, you were deployed, you served in a military conflict, and you were wounded. It's a big thing. And then all these different, discounts, and they devalue it until they don't really want any recognition. They feel like it's somehow shameful. And I think that's a shame, because that is something that we want to do for people. I also realize that the We Honor Veterans thing is great, but it's not enough to do that recognition ceremony without allowing them to talk about their legacy, talk about the time that they served and what they did. Because there were things that were done, military veterans, our Vietnam veterans had a lot of trauma during the time that they served, and their time afterwards here back in the States. I've seen stories come up that families didn't know, that as I was listening to the story for the first time that the veteran was telling, that the family was actually hearing it for the first time as well, because the patient had never shared. So there are a lot of different nuances, different influences that come into the end-of-life needs for military veterans. So, Wes, before we close, because we're getting close to the end of things, what keeps you working in chaplaincy? This job has a lot of wear and tear on us, body, mind, and spirit. But what's your why? Why do you stay in this work?
Thanks for that. And so going back to why maybe religious leaders do what they do, I personally feel a deep sense of calling, in my religious conviction, to provide that type of care, that almost a fill in the crack care for a lot of the clinical stuff. And, I just so happen to be in a position where I'm able to do that, so the timing, the training. And so I've always like the phrase, or deeply held to the phrase where, doors would open, if you knock on it. And this is like one of those things. So that keeps me going. It also keeps me going, realizing that there's this crazy chaplain shortage. So, or any listeners out there, knowing someone that would probably make a good chaplain, I would encourage them to seek out, and maybe even contact me or contact someone nearby, right? There's a gaping need for that generally, not just in the healthcare setting, but in the military. We're recruiting like crazy. But anyway, yeah, that's what keeps me going. It's that deeply held conviction to love your neighbor as yourself, and just the coincidence of having the right tools right now to do this. And I'm going to run with this as far as I can, as long as I live at least.
Well, that's good work. I'm glad you're doing it, Wes. Thanks for being on the show and talking to me today.
Absolutely. It was good to be with you, and thanks for having me on.
Wes has some strong views on the need for chaplains to be able to serve different faiths and different belief systems without proselytizing or evangelizing. So I would say I totally share that, and there are a lot of hospice professionals all over the country who share that belief, that we are to be respectful of our patients' faiths and belief systems, regardless of what our own belief systems are. We lose nothing, we compromise nothing by being respectful and supporting someone else's beliefs. Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com, and don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram, and send your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.